The moment his hand closed around my wrist in that crowded banquet hall, 17 years of silence cracked open in a single second, and I felt my knees threaten to give out beneath a blue sequin dress I had bought that very morning, hoping I would look like a woman who had moved on, when the truth was I had never stopped waiting for a question I didn't know I'd been asked. Daniel Reyes stood in front of me, older now, grayer at the temples, his eyes still carrying that same nervous intensity I remembered from a high school chemistry lab 16 years ago, and he leaned close enough that only I could hear him over the music and the laughter of 200 former classmates. And he asked the question that would unravel everything I thought I understood about my own life. Did you ever get my letter? If this story about second chances and the courage it takes to reach for them speaks to you, please take a moment to like this video, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, share it with someone who still believes people deserve another chance, and subscribe to Kindness Corner so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let's go back to where it all began. My name is Claire Whitfield, and for most of my adult life, I believed I understood exactly what had happened between Daniel Reyes and me. We met in 11th grade chemistry class at Brookhaven High, assigned as lab partners by Mr. Sanderson, a man who never could have known that his seating chart would shape the next 2 decades of 2 people's lives. Daniel was quiet in the way that made people underestimate him, the kind of quiet that came not from having nothing to say, but from choosing his words like they mattered, like they cost something to spend carelessly. He wore the same faded green jacket almost every day, carried a second-hand backpack with a broken zipper. He'd mended with a paperclip, and he had a habit of tapping his pencil against his notebook 3 times before he wrote anything down, as if he was giving his thoughts a moment to settle before committing them to paper. I was 17 and restless in a way that felt enormous at the time, desperate to be seen as someone interesting, someone whose life mattered beyond the borders of our small town. Daniel never seemed to perform for anyone. He simply existed, fully present, and somehow that made him magnetic in a way none of the loud, confident boys in our grade ever managed to be. We spent months hunched over Bunsen burners and titration charts, and somewhere between balancing chemical equations and complaining about Mr. Sanderson's impossible pop quizzes, something shifted between us that neither of us dared to name out loud. I remember the afternoon he stayed after class to help me recalculate a failed experiment, the 2 of us alone in that room smelling of sulfur and old textbooks, and how he looked up at me with an expression I had never seen a boy wear before, something unguarded and a little frightened, like he was standing at the edge of something he wanted badly but didn't trust himself to reach for. We never called it anything. We never held hands in the hallway or sat together at lunch in a way that would have announced anything to anyone. It existed in small, private gestures, the way he saved me a seat without being asked, the way he remembered that I hated the smell of formaldehyde and always positioned our dissection tray so the fumes drifted toward him instead of me, the way he once walked 4 blocks out of his way just to make sure I got home safely after a school event ran late. I told myself these were the things a good friend did. I told myself that because it was safer than admitting what I actually believed, which was that Daniel Reyes loved me the way I was slowly, quietly, falling in love with him. Then came graduation, and with it the terrifying scattering that happens to every group of 18-year-olds who suddenly discover the world is bigger than their zip code. Daniel got into a state university 4 hours away on a partial engineering scholarship, and I was headed to a small liberal arts college in the opposite direction, to study literature, a decision my parents supported with the kind of relief that told me they'd been worried I would follow a boy instead of a dream. In the chaos of final exams and packing boxes and goodbye parties that felt too loud and too bright, Daniel and I never had the conversation we should have had. There was no dramatic declaration, no promise to make it work across the distance, no acknowledgement that something real had been quietly growing between us for 2 years. We simply drifted toward our separate exits, exchanging an awkward hug at the edge of the parking lot on the last day of school, him telling me to take care of myself, me telling him the same, both of us swallowing words that felt too enormous to say out loud. For the first few months of college, I checked my email obsessively, half expecting, half hoping that Daniel would reach out. He never did. I told myself that confirmed what I had feared all along, that whatever I thought I'd felt between us had been one-sided, a story I'd constructed out of loneliness and teenage longing, rather than anything Daniel had actually felt. I threw myself into my new life the way people do when they're trying to outrun a disappointment. they refused to name. I joined the campus newspaper. I dated a string of forgettable boys who never made me feel the particular electricity I'd felt standing beside a lab bench with Daniel Reyes, and slowly, the ache of him dulled into something I could carry without it showing. Life moved forward the way it does, indifferent to the things we leave unresolved. I graduated, took a job at a marketing firm in Chicago, and 3 years later married a man named Marcus, a kind, steady accountant who loved me generously and predictably, the way you love something you're grateful to have found rather than something you couldn't imagine living without. Our marriage lasted 9 years before it quietly dissolved, not from betrayal or cruelty, but from the slow erosion that happens when two people realize they built a life together out of convenience and comfort rather than the kind of consuming love that either of us privately still believed existed somewhere, even if neither of us had ever managed to find it again. We divorced amicably when I was 34, and I moved back to my hometown 2 years later to help care for my aging mother, taking a job teaching high school English at the very school where I had once sat beside Daniel Reyes in chemistry class, memorizing the periodic table and, without realizing it, memorizing him. I built a life I was proud of in those years. I became the kind of teacher students remembered, the one who stayed late to help a struggling kid with an essay, the one who kept a drawer of granola bars for students who came to class hungry, the one who believed fiercely that small acts of attention could change the trajectory of a young person's life. Because someone had once shown me that kind of attention, and I had never forgotten what it felt like. I threw myself into my community, volunteered at the local shelter, rebuilt friendships that had frayed during my years away, and slowly assembled a version of contentment that didn't depend on anyone else completing it. But there remained, tucked away in a part of myself I rarely visited, a small, sealed room containing every question I had never let myself ask about Daniel Reyes, and the 2 years we had spent circling something neither of us had the courage to name. I heard fragments of his life over the years, the way you do in a small town where everyone is loosely connected, through someone who knows someone. He had become a structural engineer, I learned, working on bridges and infrastructure projects across 3 different states, moving frequently for work. Someone mentioned he had married young and divorced even younger. Someone else mentioned, years later, that his father had passed away and that Daniel had come back to town briefly for the funeral, though I never crossed paths with him during that visit. Each fragment landed in me like a small stone dropped into still water, sending ripples I didn't examine too closely, because examining them meant admitting that some part of me was still keeping score, still tracking the movements of a boy I had known for 2 years of my life almost 2 decades earlier. When the invitation to our 20-year class reunion arrived in my mailbox last spring, cream-colored cardstock, with the Brookhaven High School crest embossed in gold, my first instinct was to decline. Reunions had always struck me as slightly absurd, an evening of performed nostalgia where everyone competed quietly to prove their life had turned out best. But my closest friend from those years, a woman named Priya, who had stayed in touch with me through every chapter of both our lives, called me the moment she received her own invitation and refused to let me talk myself out of going. She reminded me, gently but firmly, that I had spent 17 years wondering about a boy I never had the courage to ask a single honest question, and that maybe, just maybe, this reunion was the universe handing me one last chance to close a door I had left open far too long. I told her she was being dramatic. She told me I was being a coward. She was right, and some quiet, tired part of me knew it too, which is the only reason I finally said yes. The weeks leading up to the reunion unfolded with an anxiety that embarrassed me, given that I was a 55-year-old. No, a 38-year-old woman, not a teenager anymore. Yet I found myself standing in front of my closet 3 separate times trying on outfits, Googling Daniel Reyes late at night, with a particular shame of someone who knows they're doing something a little pathetic, but can't quite stop themselves. His social media presence was sparse, a handful of photographs from work sites, and a single blurry picture from what looked like a fishing trip with friends. Nothing that told me whether he was in a relationship, whether he still thought about our town, our school, our chemistry lab, or whether, more painfully, he had forgotten all of it entirely. Filed our 2 years together under the vast category of forgettable teenage friendships that everyone accumulates and eventually discards. The night of the reunion arrived with a humid August heat that made the banquet hall's air conditioning strain audibly against the crowd of bodies filling it. I walked in wearing the blue sequin dress I had bought that morning in a fit of nervous impulsiveness, and for the first 20 minutes, I busied myself the way anxious people do at parties, gripping a glass of wine I barely drank, making bright small talk with classmates, whose names I mostly remembered and whose lives had unfolded in directions both familiar and surprising. I saw the girl who had been our valedictorian, now a pediatric surgeon, with 3 kids and tired, happy eyes. I saw the boy who had barely graduated, now running a successful landscaping business that employed 12 people. Everyone, it seemed, had a story of struggle folded somewhere beneath their polished reunion smile, and there was something quietly moving about, standing in a room full of people who had all, in their own ways, survived the last 20 years. And then, across the room, near a table draped in the school's old maroon and gold colors, I saw him. Daniel stood with his hands in his pockets, listening to someone else's story with the same patient. Present attention I remembered from our teenage years, and for a moment, 17 years collapsed into nothing, and I was 17 again, watching him from across a classroom, wondering if he would ever look up and catch me looking. As if some old muscle memory between us had never fully atrophied, he did look up, and across the crowded room. Our eyes met, and I watched something shift across his face. A flicker of recognition that quickly deepened into something far more complicated, something that looked almost like relief mixed with fear. The expression of a man who had rehearsed a moment in his mind so many times that encountering it in reality left him briefly unmoored. He excused himself from his conversation and crossed the room toward me with a directness that startled me. None of the meandering, casual approach you'd expect at a reunion where everyone was pretending not to care too much about anyone in particular. When he reached me, he didn't say any of the things people usually say in these moments, didn't comment on how long it had been or how good it was to see me, though both of those things were certainly true. Instead, he stood in front of me for a long moment, searching my face like he was trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with the girl he remembered, and then, with a quiet urgency that cut straight through 20 years of accumulated distance, he reached for my wrist and asked me to step outside with him for a moment, because there was something he needed to ask me, something he had needed to ask me for a very long time. We walked out onto the small stone patio behind the banquet hall, away from the music and the noise, into a warm evening thick, with the smell of cut grass and distant rain. The string lights strung along the patio's edge cast everything in a soft amber glow, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, both of us seemingly aware that we were standing at the threshold of a conversation that had been delayed by nearly 2 decades. It was Daniel who finally broke the silence, his voice lower and rougher than I remembered, carrying the particular vulnerability of someone who has decided to risk everything on a single question, because the alternative, silence, has already cost him too much. He asked me again, more quietly this time, almost afraid of the answer did I ever get his letter. I told him, honestly and with a growing unease I couldn't yet name, that I had no idea what he was talking about. I had never received any letter from him. Not during our senior year, not during that first lonely semester of college, when I checked my email, like it was a lifeline, not ever. Watching his face as I said this was one of the strangest experiences of my adult life, because I watched 2 decades of assumptions crumble behind his eyes in real time. Watched him recalculate an entire narrative he had apparently been living with since he was 18 years old. He explained, haltingly at first, and then with mounting urgency, that during the final week of senior year, terrified and overwhelmed by the prospect of leaving without ever telling me how he felt, he had written me a letter, 4 pages long, in which he had finally put into words everything he had never been brave enough to say out loud across 2 years of chemistry labs and quiet Friday afternoons. He told me he had written about the day he first noticed me in Mr. Sanderson's class, about the way I hummed under my breath when I was concentrating on a difficult equation, about how he had spent an entire spring semester trying to work up the courage to ask me to the junior prom before losing his nerve at the last possible moment. About how, more than anything else, he was terrified that if he let me walk out of his life without saying any of it, he would spend the rest of his life wondering what might have happened if he had simply been brave enough to speak. He had given the letter, he told me, to our mutual friend Rachel Coleman, who had been close with both of us in different ways throughout high school, asking her to pass it along to me because he couldn't bring himself to hand it to me directly. Terrified of watching my face as I read it and seeing rejection settle there in real time, Rachel had promised him she would deliver it. And then, 3 days later, before graduation, before any of it could unfold, Daniel's family had received devastating news that his older brother, stationed overseas, had been seriously injured, and Daniel's entire world had narrowed instantly to hospital visits, and frantic long-distance phone calls, and a family in crisis, and in the chaos of those final weeks. He had simply assumed his letter had reached me, and that my silence, my failure to respond, my apparent indifference at our brief goodbye in the parking lot, had been my answer. He told me that he had spent that entire first year of college interpreting my silence as the clearest possible rejection, a closed door he had no right to knock on again. And so he never reached out, never wrote again, never called, believing he was respecting a boundary I had never actually drawn. Standing on that patio, I felt something in my chest crack, open with a force that nearly buckled me, a grief so specific and so delayed that I didn't have language for it yet. 17 years. My fendu, 17 years of believing I had imagined the entire connection between us, that I had been a foolish teenage girl projecting feelings onto a boy who had simply been kind to me because kindness cost him nothing. 17 years of quietly, privately wondering what was wrong with me, that I hadn't been enough to make him reach for me the way I had wanted to reach for him. And the entire time, the truth had been sitting somewhere undelivered, lost between two teenagers and a promise that had somehow, tragically, fallen through the cracks of a family emergency that neither of us could have controlled. I asked him, my voice shaking in a way I couldn't fully control, what had happened to the letter, why Rachel had never given it to me. Daniel shook his head slowly, telling me he genuinely didn't know, that he had never had the courage to ask her about it directly in all the years since, partly because doing so would mean reopening a wound he had spent nearly 2 decades trying to convince himself had healed. He told me that seeing the reunion invitation had stirred something in him he thought he had buried permanently, a flicker of the same nervous hope he'd felt at 18, and that when Rachel Coleman's name appeared on the reunion's RSVP list, he had felt a strange magnetic pull to finally ask the question he had never let himself ask. It was at that exact moment, as if summoned by the mention of her own name, that Rachel Coleman stepped out onto the patio, laughing at something someone inside had said, only to stop short when she saw the two of us standing there, our expressions clearly heavy with something she didn't yet understand. Daniel, with a directness that surprised even me, asked her immediately, gently but without hesitation, whether she remembered a letter he had once given her to pass along to me during our senior year. I watched Rachel's face shift through several expressions in rapid succession, confusion giving way to dawning recognition, and finally, to something that looked uncomfortably close to guilt. She was quiet for a long moment before she spoke, and when she did, her voice was smaller than I remembered it, carrying the weight of a secret she had apparently carried for 17 years without ever intending to. She told us that she remembered the letter clearly, that Daniel had handed it to her outside the gymnasium after our final assembly, asking her, with a nervousness she said she had never forgotten, to make sure it reached me. She had fully intended to deliver it, she said, tucking it carefully into the front pocket of her backpack, planning to give it to me the following Monday when she saw me at our lockers. But that same weekend, her own family had been thrown into upheaval when her parents announced, without warning, that they were divorcing. And Rachel, only 18 and suddenly navigating her own private devastation, had thrown herself entirely into managing her own collapsing world. The letter, she admitted, her eyes glistening now with the particular shame of a decades-old mistake finally being confessed, had gotten buried in the bottom of that backpack, and eventually forgotten entirely amid the chaos of final exams, graduation, and the general scattering of every relationship she had once considered permanent. She told us that months later, cleaning out that same backpack before starting community college, she had found the letter, sealed and forgotten, and had been struck with a paralyzing guilt so intense that she hadn't known how to fix it. Too much time had passed, she reasoned at 18, telling herself that whatever had existed between Daniel and me had surely dissolved naturally by then, that delivering a year-old letter would only create confusion rather than clarity, that the kindest thing to do was to simply let the moment pass into the past, where it seemed to belong. She admitted, her voice breaking slightly, that she had kept the letter for years afterward, moving it from one storage box to another through several apartment changes, never quite able to throw it away, as if some part of her always knew that one day the truth would need to come out, even if she didn't have the courage to be the one to bring it forward herself. She told us she still had it. It was, improbably, sitting in a shoebox in the closet of her childhood bedroom, which her mother had never fully cleared out, less than 15 minutes from where we now stood. What happened next felt less like a decision and more like an inevitability none of us could have resisted. Rachel drove the three of us to her mother's house, apologizing repeatedly along the way with a rawness that made both Daniel and me reassure her again and again that we understood, that 18-year-olds carrying their own private crises could hardly be expected to perfectly execute the emotional errands of their friends, that this was simply one of those quiet tragedies of timing that ripple through so many lives without any single person deserving blame. Standing in the doorway of a bedroom that still, remarkably, contained faded band posters from 20 years earlier, we watched Rachel dig through a closet until she emerged, breathless, holding a slightly yellowed envelope with my name written across the front. In handwriting I recognized instantly, the same careful, deliberate penmanship Daniel had once used to label our chemistry lab reports. She handed it to me with trembling hands, and I stood there for a long moment, simply holding it, feeling the strange weight of a 17-year-old promise, finally arriving at its intended destination. Daniel watched me with an expression of naked vulnerability, the same look I imagined he must have worn the day he handed this letter to Rachel. Terrified of what my face might reveal once I finally read the words he had never had the courage to say aloud, I asked him, gently, whether he wanted me to read it now in front of them, or whether he would rather I read it alone. He told me, his voice barely above a whisper, that he had waited 17 years to know how this moment would feel, and he didn't think he could bear to wait even a few minutes longer. So I opened it, right there in that doorway, unfolding 4 pages of handwriting that had clearly been drafted and redrafted, certain lines crossed out and rewritten with the particular care of someone determined to get every word exactly right. I read about the first day he noticed me, sitting 3 seats away in Mr. Sanderson's class, wearing a yellow cardigan he apparently remembered in specific detail even now. I read about the humming he'd mentioned, a habit I hadn't even known I had. I read about the junior prom he had almost asked me to, about standing outside my house with his hand raised to knock before losing his nerve and walking the 4 blocks home alone, letting the moment slip away because he was more afraid of my rejection than he was brave enough to risk it. And then I read the final paragraph, the one that made my hands begin to shake so badly I had to steady the pages against the doorframe, in which 18-year-old Daniel Reyes had written, with a clarity that stunned me, that whatever happened after graduation, wherever life took either of us, he needed me to know that loving me quietly for 2 years had been the truest, most certain thing he had ever felt, and that if there was even the smallest chance I felt something similar, he hoped I would find him, because he intended to spend the rest of his life wondering about me otherwise. I stood in that doorway and wept, not delicately, not in the composed way I usually cried, but with the full, unguarded release of 17 years of accumulated grief, finally finding an exit. Daniel, watching me, seemed to understand instantly what my tears meant, and I watched his own composure finally break, his shoulders dropping as though an enormous weight he had been carrying silently for 2 decades had just been set down. Rachel quietly excused herself from the room, giving us the privacy that this moment, delayed by 17 years, clearly deserved. And for a long time, Daniel and I simply stood there together in the doorway of a childhood bedroom neither of us had ever expected to find ourselves in, saying nothing at all, because there was nothing left that needed saying that the letter hadn't already said for us. If this story about a letter lost to time and 2 people brave enough to finally uncover the truth has moved something in you tonight, please don't scroll past without letting us know. Like this video, if you believe love and honesty deserve a second chance, share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never truly too late. And subscribe to Kindness Corner so you can join us for more stories like this one. In the weeks that followed the reunion, Daniel and I began the strange, tender work of getting to know each other again, both of us aware that we were no longer the same 2 teenagers who had once sat side by side over a Bunsen burner, and both of us determined not to let fear steal another 17 years from us the way it had the first time. We talked for hours on the phone in the evenings, the way people rarely do anymore, catching each other up on 2 decades of separate lives. His failed marriage and mine, the careers we had built, the griefs we had each carried largely alone. I learned that he had moved back to our hometown only 8 months earlier to help care for his aging mother, a decision that had felt, at the time, like settling for a smaller life than the one he had once imagined for himself, until the reunion invitation arrived and rearranged everything he thought he understood about timing and fate. We took things slowly, both of us wiser now about the ways that rushing headlong into feelings without honest communication can quietly poison even the truest connection. We had dinner at the same small diner on Main Street where we discovered with a laugh that dissolved some of the lingering awkwardness between us. We had both individually gone to eat alone on difficult nights over the years, never once crossing paths despite living in the same small town for months. We walked the same halls of Brookhaven High during a school event I invited him to, standing together in the very chemistry classroom where it had all begun, now converted to a computer lab, and Daniel told me, with a small, disbelieving laugh that he never could have imagined, standing in that same room at 18, that he would one day return to it as a 50. As a 38-year-old man, finally getting the chance to tell the girl from lab table, for everything, he'd been too afraid to say the first time. There is no tidy cinematic ending to offer you here, no sweeping declaration or fairy tale wedding to report, because real life, unlike the movies, tends to unfold more slowly and honestly than that. What I can tell you is that 6 months after that reunion, Daniel and I are still finding our way toward each other carefully and deliberately, both of us older and more careful with our hearts than we were at 17. But both of us also more certain than ever that some connections, even when interrupted by 17 years of silence and a single letter lost to the bottom of a teenage backpack, are simply too true to stay buried forever. Rachel, for her part, has become an even closer friend to both of us than she was before, forgiven fully and completely for a mistake that any of us in her exact circumstances might have made ourselves. And I think often about how easily this story could have ended differently, how easily Daniel might never have found the courage to approach me that night, how easily I might have declined the reunion invitation entirely and never learned the truth that had been waiting patiently for me in a shoebox 15 minutes from my own front door. What I've come to understand, in the months since that letter finally reached my hands, is that so much of the pain we carry through our lives comes not from the things that actually happen to us, but from the stories we quietly construct, to explain the silences we don't understand. For 17 years, I built an entire narrative around Daniel's supposed rejection, a story that shaped how I saw myself, how I approached love, how much I believed I deserved to be chosen by someone. And that entire story, it turned out, was built on nothing more than a forgotten envelope, and a series of small human failures that had nothing to do with how Daniel actually felt about me. I think about how many of us are carrying around similarly incomplete stories right now, filling in the silences left by other people with our own worst fears, when the truth, if we were only brave enough to ask, might be something entirely different, something kinder, something we've been waiting our whole lives to hear. Before I close this story, I want to ask you for something small but meaningful. If you've ever wondered about a person from your past, someone whose silence you interpreted as an answer they never actually gave, I'd love for you to share that story in the comments below, using the word letter somewhere in your comment so we know you made it all the way to the end of this journey with us. Your stories are what make this community so special, and I read every single one. Daniel still has that letter, framed now and hanging in his study, a strange and beautiful monument to 17 years of delayed truth. A reminder, he tells me, that some words are worth waiting for no matter how long the wait becomes. And sometimes on quiet evenings, when we sit together on his porch watching the sun go down over the same small town, where we first met as teenagers who didn't yet understand what they were building, he'll turn to me and ask, with the same nervous, hopeful expression he must have worn at 18, whether I ever got his letter, and I'll tell him every single time that I got it exactly when I was meant to, not a moment too early, and certainly, thankfully, not a moment too late. If this story reminded you that it's never too late for the truth to find its way home, Please take a moment to like, comment, and share it with someone who needs a little hope today. And subscribe to Kindness Corner so we can keep telling stories like this one together.